Stanford University.
I think we will go ahead and start. So I'm Michelle Marinkovich, Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning and also a Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. And I want to welcome you to the first in this year's talk in award-winning Teachers on Teaching. And as some of you know, last year we celebrated the 100th talk in this series. And I think it's a wonderful sign of how vibrant the series continues to be that this quarter's speakers feature the Louise Hewlett-Nixon Professor of English, Andrea Lunsford, and also on November 3rd, Emeritus Professor Channing Robertson of Chemical Engineering, who was also a Senior Associate Dean of the School of Engineering, and several other speakers. I hope you'll look at the flyer, but I do notice one of our speakers, Professor Bob Siegel, who will be addressing us in May, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And thanks to the faculty who have taken time to speak in the series, thanks to the audience members and their good questions, these presentations have contributed to a campus dialogue on teaching and learning that's gotten richer and richer. So we are very grateful to all of them. And now I will turn to a brief introduction of today's speaker, and I make it brief only to give the speaker herself more time, and not because I won't be sacrificing something and having to make it brief, since Andrea has so many accomplishments that do deserve discussion. But we talk a lot on this campus with good reason about helping students to find their passion. And in Andrea, we have someone who has found her passion and lives it with such robustness, with seemingly unendless gusto. To know Andrea is to be energized by her love of writing, her love of teaching, and her knowledge of how to teach writing. So Andrea received her bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, and also her master's, both in English from the University of Florida, and then went on to do a PhD with distinction at Ohio State University. Her subsequent academic path has been an equally distinguished one, starting as an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia in 1977, and within 4 years rising there to an associate professor and also director of their writing program, leaving in 1986 to go to Ohio State University as a full professor, where she continued to establish her national and international reputation as a leader in the teaching of writing. In 2000, Stanford successfully recruited her here as a professor of English and as a director of what came to be known as the program in Writing and Rhetoric, or POWER. I remember the excitement in the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education office when Andrea accepted Stanford's offer. She had already at that point written or edited 13 books. Now it's up to 17, many in multiple editions, and dozens and dozens and dozens of influential articles in leading journals of English and composition, and an almost equally numerous number of influential book chapters. She had also already won the MLA Mina Shaughnessy Award for the best book on the teaching of language and literature, and she had won the Conference on College Composition and Communication Exemplar Award. She would go on to receive the MLA ADE Francis Andrew Mark Award for distinguished contributions to the profession of English, and also the Richard Braddock Award for Best Essay Published in College Composition and Communication. What we didn't know in 2000, but which we quickly discovered, was what a generous, gracious, and enormously energetic university citizen and colleague Andrea would be. She almost immediately founded the highly regarded and invaluable Writing Center, now the Hume Writing Center, originally started for undergraduates, but it has been extended by demand to graduate students, and it hosts a variety of campus events, many of which Andrea is at, on the diverse forms of writing and of oral expression that today's technology has made possible. She also launched a study of undergraduate writing that has informed current and future efforts regarding what, when, why, and how our students write. Her other contributions to the Power Program, her department, her School of Humanities and Science, and to Stanford as a whole are too numerous to mention, but I will note that she is the Claude and Louise Rosenberg University Fellow in undergraduate education, and that her teaching is eagerly sought after by students who want to take her courses. What a pleasure and honor it is then to turn things over to a scholar, teacher, and colleague of the very highest rank, the Louise Hewlett Nixon Professor of English, Andrea Lunsford.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much. Michelle is too kind. What? Why did that happen? I thought that to go away. She could have just said, here's Andrea, and she's old. So that's what happens when you are as old as I am. You write books and articles, and suddenly, now how can I make that go away? There. Cool. So, as Michelle said, I've been here. I first visited here. I was a visitor in 1998 and then joined the faculty in 2000. But as Michelle said, I started my career at the University of British Columbia, my first job out of graduate school in 1977. I was there for 10 years. I taught a range of courses, but my favorites were writing and rhetoric courses that balanced reading and analyzing the work of others with producing work of our own. So I set up my classes, all my classes. Well, I didn't know what I was doing. I just did it. Set up my classes workshop style, dividing the students into peer review groups. And throughout the term, the students read and critiqued each other's work. 6 ways to Sunday. We worked and worked and worked. And in those days, British Columbia's system was on the British system, and my classes lasted all year. Can you imagine what a pleasure that was? So I lectured a bit on the history and theory of both writing and rhetoric, and I led increasingly lively discussions and debates. And at the end of every term, the students completed a course evaluation. One question I asked them to answer was, what element of this course was most effective? What did you like best? I was always secretly hoping they would say, you, we liked you best. Never, not once. In 10 years, they always said the same thing. The most effective, the best part was their peer review group. With almost total unanimity, that is, and I kept these evaluations the whole time I was there. Well, I might be accused of being a slow learner, but somewhere along about the 3rd year of my teaching, I began to take note of this response and to talk with students about their experiences. What I found is that most of them had little, if any, time to work together with other students. In the fast and hectic pace of their college lives, they simply plunged from one individual assignment to the next and hoped for the best. This insight led me to begin studying collaboration and its relationship to teaching and learning, and to begin collaborating myself. Over the last 30 years, I and my co-author and friend Lisa Eade have published 2 books and 20-some articles, every word of which we have written together. A little bit of shameless self-promotion. Our latest book just came out a week ago, and I'm very pleased about that. So I have really tried hard to walk the walk as well as talk the talk about collaboration. Certainly, I'm a major advocate of collaborative learning and collaborative practices, and have been so for my entire career. Though I'm sad to say that my advocacy for collaboration and collaborative writing has failed to make many changes in the academy, especially in the humanities departments I've always been a part of. Scholarship and student work are still almost completely individual. But then, of course, we entered the digital age. And with it, what I've called the greatest literacy revolution the world has seen in 2,500 years, a revolution that is affecting all of us and our ways of communicating. In fact, as I soon discovered, seemingly simple terms that I thought I knew inside and out, like reading and writing, suddenly were much more difficult to define and pin down. In the digital age, audiences can and do often become collaborators, sometimes silent ones. Indeed, there's hardly any way to avoid this. And in this digital age, students are composing verbal and visual texts, short films, audio, essays, more than ever before, and in sites unimaginable little more than a decade ago. Email, for example, a student told me recently, is what you use if you need to contact an instructor. I'm still doing email. Then there's the spectacular rise of social networking sites, which began in earnest with 6degrees.com in 1997, hit the mainstream in 2003 with MySpace, followed by Facebook in 2004, YouTube in 2005, Twitter in 2006, Tumblr in 2007, most recently Google+. Add to these venues the staggering array of writing sites involved with fanzines, linked systems, blogs, wikis, and the accessibility of mountains of information to be sampled, shared, and used in the design of new texts, and you see something of the huge digital canvas in and on which our students are crafting and responding to messages today. In such a setting, students are more and more used to thinking of themselves as part of a network of people engaged in various discursive practices, rather than as individual writers, at least when they are at work on their self-sponsored writing, which is a lot of the time that they spend on discourses and self-sponsored work. As researchers Michelle Noble and Colin Lancashire point out, students today embody what they call new literacies, as opposed to the old literacies I grew up with, and many of you grew up with. In addition to widespread collaboration, these new literacies, those most encouraged by Web 2.0, are more participatory, more distributed in nature than conventional literacies. They are less published, think print, less individuated, less author-centric, and less expert-dominated than traditional literacies have been. New literacies involve, in other words, a different kind of mindset than literacies traditionally associated with print media. In their introduction to a new literacy sampler, Noble and Lancashire contrast what they refer to as a physical industrial mindset, which sounds like the military-industrial complex. That's the mindset I grew up with a cyber-spatial post-industrial mindset. According to Noble and Lancashire, people my age, whose experience grounds them primarily in a physical industrial mindset, tend to see the individual person as the unit of production, competence, and intelligence. They also identify expertise and authority as located in individuals and individual institutions. Those who inhabit a cyberspatial post-industrial mindset, in contrast, increasingly focus on collectives as the unit of production, competence, and intelligence. And they tend to view expertise, authority, and agency as distributed and collective. Well, the language here is somewhat dense. I can hardly say post-industrial, cyberspatial, whatever. But for me, the changes I've been describing can be summed up in one extraordinarily dramatic shift. In the 21st century, we have clearly, after 300 years of total hegemony of print, we have clearly moved from a focus on and a valuing of consumption to a focus on and a valuing of production. That is to say, we're seeing a swing in cultural capital from learning as largely passive consuming to soaking up the best of what has been thought and said and handed out to us by others, including teachers, shifted from that to learning as doing, as active production, both of knowledge and of texts. Another way to say this is there's been a big cultural shift from reading to writing. And we can talk about that more later. Students are writing more today than they've ever written, I think, in the history of the world. Few things better exemplify this new sense of textual interaction, collaboration, shared ownership, and production than Wikipedia, which it's hard for me to remember. It's only been around since 2001. With nearly 20 million articles in 282 languages and growing daily, Wikipedia offers limitless opportunities for collaboration, for participation, for performance, as contributors are simultaneously co-authors and the audience for their own and the work of other co-authors. Well, my students not only consult Wikipedia, many of them contribute to it. But students also engage in other kinds of online, collaborative, participatory, distributed projects. In convergence culture, for instance, Henry Jenkins, who until a year or two ago was the director of MIT's Comparative Media Studies program, notes that more than 60% of the content for the video game The Sims was generated by its fans, more than 60%. In his study, Jenkins points to many examples of fans playing central roles in what he refers to as transmedia storytelling. One example involves players who work together as a group called the Cloud Makers to play The Beast, a video game created to promote Steven Spielberg's 2001 film AI. According to Jenkins, the number of players who participated in the Cloud Makers collaborative effort ranged from 500 to more than 7,500. This collaboration engaged not only those working together to play the game, but the game designers as well, since the designers often reacted to players in real time. As Tom, one of the players, said to Jenkins, as we cloud makers got better and better at solving their puzzles, the designers had to come up with harder and harder puzzles. They were responding to stuff we were saying and doing online. To be sure, much of the collaborative online writing that students are so keen to do is self-sponsored, writing that some might characterize as communicating for entertainment, like in the case of gaming. But not always. In fact, I think gaming is very serious, a very serious learning tool, too. I think, for instance, of one of my favorites, Heather Lauver, a homeschool teenager who at the age of 14 launched the Daily Prophet, a web-based school newspaper for Harry Potter's fictional Hogwarts. Before you could even say Quidditch, the newspaper had a staff of hundreds of kids from around the world working on it. More importantly, when Heather's and other sites devoted to the Potter series were threatened by Warner Brothers, and threatened big time, she formed a large association called Defense Against the Dark Arts and worked with fans throughout the world to protect their freedom to publish fan fiction online, and those kids were successful. If you haven't seen the rollout of Pottermore, has everyone seen that? If we have time to look at it, Pottermore is now live, and it's J.K. Rowling has caught on to the new literacies finally. She was very resistant for a long time. But Pottermore is a totally open participatory site where I think she said the first 1 million people, the first 1 million to sign up, we're going to get some kind of special deal. We could look it up on YouTube if we have time. So the examples of Tom the Cloud Maker and Heather Lauver emphasize the gap that currently exists between the highly collaborative, participatory, productive, self-sponsored online writing that many students are doing and the writing they are asked to do when they enter a lot of our classrooms. From one perspective, this gap is not at all new. A gap has always existed between the values, expectations, interests, and experiences students bring to the academy and the values, expectations, interests of their instructors. That gap is always going to be with us to some extent. I was so shocked this week in my undergraduates, in my sophomore seminar, when nobody in the room knew who the Marx Brothers were. Yet today, that gap seems especially wide. Students out of class are composing across a range of multimodal genres, most often in concert with others. Yet the majority of their college classes are still individual learners, the single writer or author that I first tried to describe and critique over 30 years ago. Today, however, others are calling attention to this discrepancy, arguing that we must move beyond the single writer and the printed page and allow students to engage fully with what Aristotle called all the available means of persuasion, and that would be all the available technological means of persuasion. In the words of researcher Cynthia Self, students today need a full quiver of semiotic modes from which to select, role models who can teach them to think critically about a range of communication tools and multiple ways of reaching their audiences. It goes without saying that all these goals demand collaboration. I've been talking fairly generally, so I'd like to pause now to take a look at some of our Stanford students who seem to me definitely to inhabit the cyber-spatial post-industrial mindset. Here is Sparker 2, for example, who is an avid contributor of Twitter. Stephanie, or Sparker 2, tweets with a purpose. And in fact, I've got a lot of students that are very, very purposeful tweeters. Whether she's trying to get information or to give information from the very large group of people who follow her. As you can see here, she's an avid fan of Korean cinema. She's fluent in Korean as well as 2 or 3 other languages. She tweets every day or two to her large group of followers with what amounts to little tiny reviews. She She announces her topic, she gives an evaluation of it, and she tells you how to go to it herself, like a little mini Amazon review, tiny, tiny little review. Her writing is participatory, performative, collaborative, with many other people. It's aimed at action. It's aimed at promoting Korean film. For another example, take a look at an advertisement produced by students taking Stanford's second required course on writing and rhetoric. I don't know if you can see this, but it says, some people say they would rather die than speak in front of people. So this means that if they were at a funeral, they'd rather be in the coffin than give the eulogy. That's a quotation from Seinfeld. They say then, we prepare you for the eulogy in PWR too. Very pleased with themselves. Not content with doing the course assignments, which were hefty enough, these students set out to use the skills they were learning to create ads of their own. They were in a course on analyzing the rhetoric of advertising. They also wanted, by the way, to parody their course a little bit. This spoof ad was created by a group of students working together on their laptops, making use of software programs like Photoshop, and they were producing discourse. They were not simply studying advertisements, they were making advertisements of their own. And they were certainly practicing new literacies, that is, literacies that are participatory, collaborative, performative, distributed. Note also that these students don't blink at using images they take from the web. And we could talk about this a lot. This is a practice that is raising many questions about and challenges to traditional notions of copyright. Just one more quick example. Here's a website designed by a Stanford student and her colleagues in the Stanford Labor Action Coalition. We all get the reference there to this brown fist squeezing the life out of the Hoover Tower. Most audiences might not get that. This group has created a lot of attention around the issue of a living wage for temporary workers on our campus. They've been absolutely persistent in doing so over the years I've been here, and they are doing this collaboratively, and they're doing it multimodally. And I could show you many other things that they've created aside from this website. I could offer many other examples, and I know everyone in this room could as well. Digital collages, audio essays, all manner of mashups and remixes. But I think I've made my point. Literacy is changing in swift and significant ways, and those changes offer challenges as well as opportunities for us teachers in the digital age. The first challenge I see, I've already alluded to it, is to higher education's deeply individualistic system that rewards individual students through a system of individual grades and points and values the individual GPA above almost everything. To say the least, working collaboratively runs counter to that system. I don't think we can or should abandon an emphasis on the individual. The college years are a very rich time of identity formation, as we all know. But I do think that we must temper that emphasis, since we know that our current system doesn't do enough to prepare students to thrive in the highly collaborative digital environment I've been describing. We see calls for a move in this direction really everywhere. This month's Atlantic, which I just got a couple of days ago, for instance, features an article by Richard Florida on the relationship between sociality and progress. He concludes by saying, today's students need a stronger focus on teamwork, persuasion, and entrepreneurship, a better integration of liberal arts with technological literacies, and an emphasis on social intelligence that makes for creative collaboration and leadership. To respond to Florida's call, teachers need to do more than assign collaborative projects, so that's not a bad way to start. We need to provide a strong theoretical rationale for such projects along with data to support it, since students steeped in the rhetoric of individualism often resist collaboration. In addition, we need to craft collaborative projects that will engage every member of a group and guide the group in analyzing their work together from beginning to end. In other words, the processes that they've engaged in, as well as the product that they end up with. A second challenge we're beginning to grapple with is the ongoing notion of our classrooms as private spaces. In the digital age, these spaces are irrevocably public. Here's an example of what I mean. Imagine this. A student in an undergrad course composes a research-based argument and then presents an oral version of the argument as part of a panel at an in-class live conference held at the end of the term. The teacher of the class creates a website, posts all of the student arguments on it, spoken and written, and invites response from the students as well as other audiences. 2 years later, this teacher gets a response from a professor at another university saying that one student's argument drew on this professor's work and citing it, but in one instance failing to enclose a directly quoted passage within quotation marks. The professor demanded the student's argument be taken off the website, accused the student of sloppy habits at best and plagiarism at worst. Notified of this turn of events, the student, who is now a prospective graduating senior with a very strong GPA and getting ready to go to law school, was completely taken aback and surprised. He had not meant to plagiarize. He had not imagined that one of his sources would go to the trouble of accessing his essay. Neither had his teacher. I think that has been an instructive lesson to me when I'm building websites for my students' work. It's how careful we have to be, although a few years ago, Marvin Diogenes and I interviewed a wonderful bunch of our colleagues in computer science, and they all expressed support for open source, the open source movement. And they were all using Linux, and they were all did a lot of copying and pasting code from the web, as you would absolutely expect. But they wanted their work to be cited scrupulously, and one of them was absolutely outraged when he found some handout that he had made up, posted on a lot of websites around the world, often with attribution, but sometimes without attribution. He was absolutely horrified. So we want open source for everybody but us. And this professor falls into that category. Like many others, this student experiences the internet and many of its sites as fairly private, when the reality is that audiences are there all the time, browsing, searching, engaging, responding, sometimes accusing. Many scholars and commentators have noted the breakdown between private and public today, and on the somewhat contradictory attitudes our students hold. Students often say they're comfortable being in public, that a public stance comes with the territory of digital communication. But they also sometimes view sites, and especially social networking sites, as relatively private, away from the prying eyes of their parents and other unwanted audiences. As Ari Melber notes, critics argue that privacy does not matter to children who were raised in a wired celebrity culture that promises a niche audience for everyone. Why hide when you can perform? But even if young people are performing, many are clueless about the size of their audience. And I'm sure you've been reading about Stanford's efforts to have a campus in New York, and also about some of our own online offerings. You may know that our colleague Sebastian Thrun is offering an introduction to artificial intelligence free, and I think the last time I checked, 103,000 people around the world have signed up for it. Public indeed. That we could spend a year talking just about what that means to teachers and to institutions like Stanford. Clearly, even though many of our students are completely at ease in the digital landscape, we need to help them become more knowledgeable about the nature and complexity of the audiences for whom they perform, particularly as they shift back and forth from self-sponsored online writing to academic writing. As teachers, then, we have some responsibility for unpacking this concept of audience, since, as the example suggests, the teacher's not the sole audience in a digital world, far from it. But unpacking the concept of teacher as audience and the larger concept of audience in general, we can help students understand the contemporary complexities of online audiences by asking them to conduct a genealogy of audiences for a particular site. And the one that I've been had students working with most recently are the many pro-anorexia sites on the web. If you haven't seen them, don't look at them. They're just too horrifying for words. But students need to do genealogies of the audiences of these sites. Who are their sponsors? What kinds of collaboration is going on in these sites? And who is reading them? Who's posting to them? What kind of critical conclusions can they draw about such sites? A third challenge to teaching in the digital age aims at another key classroom issue. How can we help students learn best? We know that students have varying learning styles. We have varying learning styles, and that many of our students, many of us, are visual learners. More important, increasing evidence shows that all of us, but especially young people today, learn best by doing, by producing, by participating, rather than by consuming. So I've been hammering on that point. So I've mentioned this point before, but now I want to tease out one of the strongest implications for us as teachers. It's looking more and more like the lecture, which I'm ironically delivering, is not the best format for teaching. Last spring, as Michelle said, Harry Elam gave a wonderful, that was the 100th lecture, right? Harry's, exploring the question, is the lecture dead? In it, Harry didn't carry out a post-mortem yet, but he did suggest that the lecture is under attack from many different sources. As one professor from the University of Maryland put it, a physicist, I think, with modern technology, if all there is lectures, we don't need faculty. Get them to do it once, put it on the web, and then fire them. This professor is being facetious, but facetious with a purpose. His point is that in the digital age, the purpose of teaching has shifted from the lecture as a means of disseminating information. After all, as I noted earlier, information is in no scarcity. We're bombarded with it. So it's shifting from the lecture as a means of disseminating information to a focus on helping students understand the information that they have. Over 20 years ago, researchers at Berkeley, concerned about the disproportionate failure of African American students in their math classes, carried out a series of studies that concluded that these students were bright and they were working really, really hard to learn the material by attending lectures and studying on their own. And what this particular researcher did was to find a group of students who were succeeding in the math classes, and then I would never do this in 100 million years. He moved into the dorm with these students who were doing very well on the math, and he saw that they were working in groups all the time. They were relentless. They would not quit until every single person in the group could do all of the math and understand it. So what they did was to put the students that were having trouble with math in learning groups, and very carefully design learning groups and with a lot of scaffolding for the groups. They asked them to teach one another, and within a year, they had turned this very troubling trend around. Some of the African American students said to the researchers, I've gotten where I am by studying on my own. And that is the way I have achieved, and that's how I know to achieve. And in this case, what had worked so well through high school suddenly was not working as well in college. More recently, Harvard physics professor Eric Mazur and his colleagues came to a similar conclusion based on their observations that while their students were passing their courses in physics and chemistry, they were not getting major concepts. At first, Mazur did what most of us would do. He decided to give better lectures. He gave what he thought was a thorough, thoughtful, indeed memorable explanation of a particular concept. I thought I had nailed it, he says. It was the best explanation that could possibly be given of this question. Trouble was, when he asked students if they had any questions, nope, nobody did. And then when he gave a quick checkup problem, he realized 60% of the class still didn't get the concept at all. In describing this incident, he said he just threw up his hands. He was in the middle of class, a big class, 150 students. He just didn't know what to do. So he said, okay, how about discussing the question with each other? Then he said, something happened in my classroom that I'd never seen before. The classroom erupted in chaos. They were dying to explain this problem to one another and to talk about it. This experience, I mean, you can imagine, he said, it was a very humbling experience. I thought I nailed it. This led Professor Mazur to give up lecturing in favor of what he and his colleagues call peer instruction. And rather than teaching by telling, he now teaches by questioning and by letting the students work together to solve the problems. This is a pretty intricate system that involves the students reading ahead of time, sending in questions. He uses the questions to design the day's work. And then he uses clickers so that they can test out their hypotheses and work together. So it's a very well orchestrated system. In doing so, he's addressing the participatory, collaborative, productive nature of the new literacies and asking his students to be the active producers of knowledge. A final challenge I want to touch on is one that has been particularly daunting to me, and I think to many who teach writing. It concerns the new literacies as well, but in a different way, since new literacies, as we have discovered, often call for new texts, sometimes referred to as new media texts. The question of whether and how to assign and teach such new media writing is a very vexing one. to many people in a collection of essays called Writing New Media, which paints a rich picture of the kinds of writing students are increasingly doing today both inside and outside the classroom. Cynthia Self points out the double-edged sword that comes along with new media texts in the classroom. She tells the story of David, a young man who teaches himself to produce very successful and effective new media texts, in this case websites, and one other thing I can't quite remember, only to fail his college classes because of his inability to create acceptable traditional print texts. The point Self makes is one that rings especially true to me. How can I retain and value the best of the old literacies while allowing my students to participate in and embrace the new? In short, it seems to me that now my goal must be to help students acquire a repertoire of styles and strategies that can help them deliver their messages in the medium and form most appropriate for a particular purpose and audience. And that is a big task. I have a student in my graduate seminar right now who is intent on doing a 10-minute film about House of Leaves. I want for him to do this, but do I know how to do a 10-minute film? No, I do not. And so we're going to have to be working together on this with other people in the classroom. He could write a 15-page essay in his sleep, but that's not what he wants to do. So that's why I say that it's such a tall task, because it makes me have to learn many new things, and I'm happy to do it. I just feel a little bit inadequate. That said, I've seen professors all over the country asking students to work with new media to learn and perform better. Recently, I saw a presentation given by a professor of German who had been persistently disappointed by his students' progress. With the help of the Technology Support Office at his university, he asked the students to stop writing essays in German and instead to write and produce a video on some aspect of German culture. The students had to decide on the aspect, do some research on it, figure out a way to capture what they wanted to say in images, and write and deliver a voiceover for the video. At first, the students who were working together on these projects were wary of this assignment. It sounded strange and different and maybe really hard. The teacher was equally wary of it, but they plunged in together and did it. And when the students' performance on exams and their comprehension and production of German skyrocketed, they became true believers. I heard that day I heard 5 professors from 5 different fields talk about how they were using new media in their assignments, in their classes, to help their students learn better. I imagine that most people in this room have experienced the 4 challenges I've been describing, and that you have met them in ingenious and effective ways. One thing seems very clear to me. We are, whether we want to or not, we are living and teaching in a digital age, and each challenge we face opens up opportunities for us to expand our own teaching and learning repertoires, to join our students as learners, and to engage in the kind of highly participatory, distributed, and performative practices characteristic of this age. And not to put too fine a point on it, collaboration has everything to do with it. Thank you so much. Now we can... Now, I was trying to deliver that in half an hour, so we'd have as much time as possible to talk, so forgive me for that lecture, that anti-lecture lecture, and for my pathetic attempts at, I'm now trying to learn to use Prezi. God knows what next. So which of these challenges or areas would you like to talk about? Yes, please.
One of your slides said that it's shifted from an age of consumption to production. It seems to me that the consumption has also ratcheted up quite a bit, and that part of the thing that the students at all levels are dealing with is this flood, right? I mean, it's certainly not limited to academic journals, but it's there too. But how are you finding that students collaborating or not collaborating are dealing with all of this information that they have at the end of a Google search? It's there in a second.
See, that's what we need. That's what we need to be helping them with, not pouring on more information, but helping them deal with the information that they've already got. I will tell you one concrete change that is made in my teaching practices just in the last few years. I've started asking my students. I have a pretty robust coursework site for every class I teach. Probably everybody does, and I put a ton of stuff on there. But I say to the students, okay, we'll agree together what we are all going to read, but it's not going to be that much. And I want you to pick and choose. I want you to skim. I want you to dip in and out, because that's what they do on the web, of that material until you find what you're really interested in, and then I want you to follow that path, and I'll be here to follow it with you. So and I could, geez, don't get me started on this. I gave a lecture, talk this summer to the ADE Western Conference about what is a reader today. Reading practice, I've been talking about changes in writing, but changes in reading are equally dramatic. And I think this ability to work through masses of information, not getting bogged down and having to read every word, is something that our students are doing. Yeah, what did President Bush tell us to do at 9/11? Get out there and buy things. Consume. I mean, it's ridiculous to say America's not a consumer culture. We are. But the focus in young people and in learners, I think, is moved away from wanting to just suck up everything. They want to do something. I was telling a colleague last week, if you want students to read Piers Plowman, which might be questionable anyway, but I think I loved Piers Plowman until the students said, by the time I figured out it was about this guy riding around on a horse in England, we'd gone on to the next to the next text. Piers Plowman is a difficult text. If we want students to read it, or read anything, we have to let them do something with it, not just take it in. And that's the remixes, the mashups, I'm teaching with an undergraduate student a course on Neil Gaiman, International Man of Mystery, this quarter on Monday nights. And we just started The Sandman, and we're reading one of the issues that has Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream in it. Students want to do stuff like that. So it's not a surprise to me that in the Department of English, Tom, how many of our majors have creative writing emphasis?
Over half of them, I think.
I think it's about 60%. They want to get into those creative writing classes where they are doing something. Now, I love our creative writing classes, but I want them to want to get into my class to do something as well, and so that we're trying to do that. So that's what I mean. Students today are fearless. Now they're ready to get out there and mix it up and to work with materials and try to make something of their own. If they fail, they fail. They go on and try to make something else. Yes, Jillian.
I have a question about alternatives to the lecture model, specifically in classes that are really big. So if you have a class of over 100 students, it's very easy to move away from the lecture model and incorporate collaboration into a smaller class. But what would you do? Could you give us an idea of what an alternative to the lecture would look like in a larger class setting?
Well, in the sciences, this Eric Mazur at Harvard has got a really robust model. I mean, that's what he's doing. It's got 150 to 200 students every single term, and he lectures very little. He says he comes into the classroom and he talks maybe 5 minutes. He tries to set up the issues for the day. And then he immediately starts with the questions that the students have submitted, and he takes them one by one. He puts them on the projector, and then he asks them to call out various ways of responding to that problem, which they do, and then they vote on what the right answer is. They are almost all wrong the first time around, like 70% don't get it right. And then he says, all right, work together. And the few people in the room who've got it right start trying to convince the others until they have managed to teach that. And I read an interview with some students who had been in his class, and they said, we've learned how to deal with lectures. We learned how to listen, and we record, and we get that information out of there, and we were doing pretty well. Now he changes this up on us. But after the term was over, they were all convinced that this was a better way for them to learn. At the University of Miami University of Ohio, liberal arts institution in Ohio, the president there is trying to bring about a total university change in this direction. And he decided he would start with the biggest and some of the most popular classes. Well, some drama class was one of the most popular and one of the biggest. It fulfilled a couple of general education requirements, and students perceived that it wasn't all that hard, and it was a strict lecture course. And they decided they would do something different, and so the students started to perform in groups. They had to actually perform and then explain what they were doing in their performances. The students rebelled, they marched, they carried on, and they actually forced the president to have a meeting with them. They said, we don't want to be active learners. We want to sit there and be entertained. But of course, we've got just busfuls of information that say they might be entertained, but they're not learning. They're not going to retain this. So this is going to be a painful shift. But I am persuaded that we have enough evidence that we can develop models for large classes that will work. One of my dear friends in my field of rhetoric and writing studies, David Bartholomew at the University of Pittsburgh, says when he got married, he's been married a long time, he had to sign a marriage contract that said he would spend every sabbatical in Spain. And he did it, and he spent every sabbatical in Spain, and so he's gotten a couple of grants to Fulbrights and so forth to work there. And once he was in a university in northern Spain, and they assigned him to teach a writing class, and there were 180 students in it. And he said, okay, yeah, what am I going to do? But he developed a way to have the students working in groups so that he was more the guide on the side instead of the sage on the stage. We all heard that, and it took him the better part of a month to kind of get the logistics worked out. But then for the rest of the year, he felt like it worked. The students were very hesitant because all their other classes were straight lectures, so he didn't have that easy of a time with it, but he did it. So I saw it, yes. Yeah, hi.
Actually, hi. I'd like to actually ask a follow-up question. So I guess it's a little bit complicated, but having read I understand that if you want to teach acting or you want to teach writing, that you have to act or you have to write. And I actually have read the Mazur study, and one thing that is disturbing about it is that he doesn't control either for the amount of faculty time input, which is about 10 or 20 times what it was when he was lecturing, or the amount of student time put, which was also much greater than when he was lecturing. So maybe there's a motivational issue involved. But my question is, what do you do with something like medicine? So how do you teach a body of knowledge like medicine, in an interactive fashion? Since an hour interactive covers far less material than an hour. It might be good learning, but it's less material covered. So
yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful question, and I think the answer partly is that less turns out to be more, and particularly in the field of medicine. So a doctor in England named M.L.J. Abercrombie wrote a book called The Anatomy of Judgment about medical education. And it was horrifying what she found from studying doctors who'd gone through the medical system there. And she almost single-handedly instituted a revolution in med school training in the British Isles around collaboration. And that model was about, I think, 15 years ago now, adopted by med schools in the Research Triangle in North Carolina. When the students come in their first year in med school, they're put into research teams with major questions that they have to answer. The professors are there to meet with them, but they have to go out and essentially do a bunch of diagnoses on their own. And what they have found is that the diagnoses, the ability to diagnose, gets better and better and better through this less is more model. Now, I'm not in medicine and really can't speak with any kind of authority. I think Eric Mazur would say that he did front load an enormous amount of time, but that the time later is less, and that he also got a lot more TAs to be with him with those groups than he had when he was just lecturing. I've only talked to him once, but so I think we all have to cover bodies of material, but I think our sense that we can cover those bodies of material just by saying we have done so is suspect. Yeah, Michelle.
Andrew, one issue that comes up as part of this discussion is grading.
Yes.
Because in the old system, with the emphasis on the individual work, it was pretty cut and dry what the grading standards were and how you judged any individual student. But in the new system where work is collaborative, a lot of faculty say they have problems deciding how to fairly grade. So I'm just curious what your own decisions in that area have been and whether you're comfortable with them and,
Yeah.
and
Well, I'm not comfortable with the grading system that we have, period. But that said, the first book that Lisa Ede and I wrote on collaboration, we studied people in 7 different professions across the humanities and the sciences and engineering. And we surveyed 2,500 members of every group, and then we, remember the day, are people old enough in here to remember punch cards? There's boxes and boxes of punch cards you're dragging around with all this data, these data on them. Then we interviewed and we did site visits with at least one team or one person in all these 7 groups, and we saw them working collaboratively. And in the workforce, I'm worried with my students. Am I going to give for a group project, am I going to give an individual grade or am I going to give a group grade? And those are real concerns. But I can tell you that out there in the workforce, they are not worried about that at all. It's what that group comes up with, what had the success of the product, that's what counts. Now, they have ways of knowing over time who is contributing most and best. But their focus is not on trying to worry about the individual experience. I always give group grades, but I know other people who don't. But when I give, there are a lot of people, especially in the sciences on our campus, whose students work in collaborative teams all the time, and I think they tend to mostly to give group grades. But one tip I can give, when I have a group working, I like to have them working on a long-term project. They might be doing a peer review for one day, but a collaborative project for me means weeks, 5, 6, 7 weeks that they're working together. So I ask them to monitor their progress and to report to me every week in a short note online, each student in the group, what did you contribute to the group? What did I contribute to this week? What did everybody else contribute? What problems did we encounter? How did we solve them? How could we make the group work better? And it's pretty quick. There's something out there in the land, those of you who've been on teams will know this, something called the martyr syndrome. Because early on in a collaborative project, I'll get response from the students, and everyone in the group says, I'm doing all the work. Nobody else is doing anything. It's all my ideas. And so I have to sort of cajole them out of that martyr syndrome into really thinking about who is doing what. But you very quickly find out whether there is a deadbeat or a couple of deadbeats, or whether one person is trying to be the teacher and the leader and won't let anybody else talk. You find out those things very quickly if you just monitor. Tom.
Andrea, I was really interested in, really one of the first things you said was that peer feedback had gotten such high marks in the evaluations, and then also in particular with the math students in Berkeley working together and improve themselves. Can you just speak to, in your classes or just in your research, what specific structure seems to work in a peer feedback session or a peer study session?
Yeah, really good question too. Well, I've done a lot of different things over the years. With Stanford students, I ask them to be in groups of 3. I don't even numbered groups are not good for all kinds of reasons, but I tend to like 3 or 5, and I ask them to respond to each other's work on a regular basis. So we use coursework, we have the discussion forum, we have Dropbox, so on and so forth, that we can use all of those. They post their drafts, and then they start responding to each other's drafts. When they come into class to do a peer review session, they're armed with the responses that they have done. And I ask students to write to each other directly. Dear Michelle, I just finished working on your draft, and here's what I got out of it. And here's what I didn't understand. And here are my ideas for what you might do. And I find that my students begin to take this process very seriously when they see what good ideas their colleagues have. And Stanford students are really keen. We just had one of these sessions in my class, in my sophomore seminar yesterday, about the projects that they're going to pursue all term long. And what the other students in the class called out, they were each giving 5-minute presentations on their proposals, what they wanted to study for the rest of the term. The other members of class were calling out fabulous resources, great ideas, picking up on things they'd missed. It was electric and so thrilling to see each other, see students working together like that. But I have to model this for them And because many of them have done peer group in high school, and it was really sappy, and it's what they did when the teacher couldn't think of anything else to do, and they don't want to do it. And sometimes they think they might give away their good ideas if they're in a peer group. So I have to show them how this can work. There's a wonderful videotape produced by Oregon State University, the University of Washington in Seattle, that has a peer group working that's really very successful, very effective session. So I have to really, as I said, we have to not just assign collaborative projects, we have to sell, we have to explain why they are worthwhile and what the research shows about them, and then we have to model the behavior for doing that, because it's not what they are used to. But as that person in Richard, Florida in the Atlantic was saying, this is what the expectations are in the digital workplace. It's absolutely the base expectation. Yep, Michelle?
I have a slightly different kind of question. As you mentioned, you not only encourage collaboration among your students, but you practice it in your own academic work. And a lot of people are still hesitant, a lot of especially young academics, to do that because they're afraid that they may not get the kind of credit in their academic record. So is there something you've done in your collaborations to kind of cover that base, or do you think that's a baseless
When I came up for tenure and promotion early at the University of British Columbia, to my surprise, then they spent 2 days on my one case. Can you imagine how I felt? Because they were talking about all of my collaborative work. I mean, they might have been talking about other things, other horrible things about me. When Lisa came up for tenure, I got a letter from her chair asking me if I would write an unsolicited letter with line counts. How many lines did she write and how many lines did I write? Which, the way we write together, that's impossible. So I did write the unsolicited letter, and I made the best case I could, and she did get tenure. But in humanities especially, collaborative work is still suspicious. And we need to let young scholars know they need to be careful and find out what the norms and expectations of their departments are. But we're moving in this way. We should have collaborative dissertations. There has never been a good dissertation written that was not collaborative. You cannot convince me of that. And so I know of 2 collaborative dissertations in the humanities, 2 only, and in one they made them split it into 2 at the end, which is not exactly what I would call a success. But I think that is coming. I'm reminded of a very distinguished British historian, I think his name is David Winter, who did the Great War. Remember that PBS, BBC production documentary about the Great War, which was so wonderful. He said he took that on, and it was the hardest job he'd ever done because it was so collaborative, and he had to be working with people in Hollywood and people in London and all this team of videographers, and it was just a huge collaboration. And he said he believes that he took this on because he's a senior person in his field, and he said, if I'm not going to do this, who should do it? It's got to be our senior colleagues stepping out and taking on this challenge. And then he said, and this is what really kind of stayed with me, if we want public history to persist, this is what we have to do. We cannot sit in the library and write a single authored book and think that that is going to keep public history going. It's not going to. And this was about 15 years ago that he said that. So that I was sitting in the audience just sort of, feeling like I was being assaulted almost when he said that, but I've thought about it so much since then. So I think that's another very good question, that I think we really need senior scholars to step out and take chances and do things that will then make a model for younger people to follow. I think I probably just exhausted you. I thank you again for being here. And Michelle, thank you for having me.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.